Bruce was a resilient, scrappy kid, barely 10, but wise beyond his years. Life had forced him to grow up fast. He spent most of his days wandering the city streets, trying to scrounge up enough money to keep his small family afloat. His mother, Chloe, had always been his anchor, but in recent years, her health had been fading rapidly. What had started as minor aches had turned into severe, unrelenting pain, and the local doctor's diagnosis weighed heavily on both of them. Bruce knew that without proper medication and care, his mother's condition would only worsen. But with no steady income and hardly any family to lean on, they were trapped in a vicious cycle of poverty and desperation. Each morning, Bruce would leave their small rundown apartment and scour the city for ways to make money. Sometimes he'd pick up odd jobs, like carrying groceries or sweeping floors at nearby shops, but the pay was always meager. He'd long since learned not to waste time dreaming of a better life. Theirs was a life of survival, where every meal was a blessing, and every day together felt like a victory. Yet, as Chloe's strength waned, Bruce's worry grew. He could see it in her eyes, the exhaustion, the dulling light that used to sparkle with hope. She tried her best to shield him from the full weight of her pain, but Bruce knew her too well. They were all each other had, and they both knew that without her, he'd be entirely alone. One evening, after a particularly hard day of finding very little work, Bruce returned to find Chloe gasping for breath, her frail body curled up in pain. Fear overtook him as he dropped his day's earnings, a handful of coins, onto the table and rushed to her side. Her skin was cold and her breathing shallow. Desperation clawed at him. He knew he had to do something more drastic to save her. That night, he barely slept, formulating a plan in his mind. The next morning, Bruce gathered the few possessions he could carry, determined to raise money by any means possible. He'd noticed that people on the bustling main street were always in a rush, and he hoped they might be more willing to buy something small if it meant saving them a few minutes. So, he pulled his last bit of change into a small stash of candy, deciding he'd try selling it to passers-by. He set up near a busy intersection, calling out to the people hurrying by. Some ignored him, a few looked at him with pity, but he kept his head up, determined not to let shame take over. It wasn't easy. He faced more rejection than he had anticipated, but he managed to sell a few pieces by the end of the day. As he was counting his earnings, he heard a commotion nearby. A woman lay collapsed on the sidewalk, clutching her chest in obvious distress. Instinct took over, and Bruce quickly moved to her side, offering what little assistance he could. It was Rose, a well-dressed, poised woman who seemed very out of place in the part of town Bruce usually called home. He didn't know her, but something in her eyes reminded him of his mother. A quiet desperation, a sense of vulnerability she tried to hide. Bruce stayed by her side until help arrived, and once she was safely taken away, he returned to his task. Unbeknownst to him, this chance encounter would create a ripple that would come back to affect him in ways he could never imagine. That evening, Bruce returned home with a small sense of pride. He hadn't raised much, but it was something. Chloe greeted him with a weak smile, her eyes clouded with pain and a sadness she could no longer hide. Sensing a moment of seriousness, she took his hand and gently guided him to sit beside her. For a long time, she was silent, as if she was struggling to find the words to say. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. She told Bruce of a man from her past, someone she had once loved deeply but had been forced to leave behind. This man, she revealed, was likely his father, a man of considerable wealth and influence. Bruce listened intently, his heart pounding as she continued. Chloe reached into a small box under her bed and pulled out a faded photograph. In it, a younger version of her stood beside a man with a kind smile. A man Bruce had never seen before, but felt an immediate connection to. His mother's trembling hands clutched the photo tightly, and she looked at him with tears in her eyes, apologizing for keeping it from him all these years. Bruce was stunned, a flood of emotions washing over him as he stared at the man in the photo. For the first time in his life, he had a face to go with the vague idea of a father he had always secretly held in his heart. As the days passed, Bruce couldn't shake the image of the man from his mind. Every night, he would look at the photo, tracing the man's face with his fingers and imagining what it might be like to have him in his life. He could barely sleep, torn between anger and hope. Why had his father abandoned them? Why hadn't he helped Chloe when she needed it most? Yet, part of him clung to the idea that maybe, just maybe, this man could be the answer to their prayers. With his mother's health worsening by the day and their resources dwindling, Bruce made up his mind. Bruce spent the next few days wandering the city, clutching the worn photograph of the man he believed to be his father. Every face he saw, every figure that vaguely resembled the man in the photo, made his heart skip a beat. But as he got closer, each turned out to be a stranger. Exhaustion and desperation weighed on him, but he knew he couldn't give up, not with Chloe's life at stake. As he walked, he began asking people if they recognized the man in the photograph, showing it to shopkeepers, passers-by, and street vendors, hoping someone might point him in the right direction. Most people shrugged him off or looked at him with pity, while a few simply told him he was wasting his time. But he pressed on, determined not to let the hope die out. One afternoon, as he wandered through the more affluent side of town, Bruce noticed a large office building that seemed grander and more imposing than anything he'd ever seen. He remembered the few details his mother had shared about his father. That he was a man of wealth, a business owner who had once held dreams of becoming even more. This building, with its tall glass walls and polished marble floors, seemed like the kind of place his father might belong to. Nervously, he approached the receptionist, a neatly dressed woman who gave him a puzzled look when he pulled out the photograph and asked if she knew the man. She stared at the photo for a moment, then looked back at him with a mix of confusion and sympathy. Politely, she told him she couldn't help and suggested he leave. Bruce felt his hope waver, but he thanked her and left, determined to try elsewhere. Days turned into weeks, and Bruce found himself drifting further and further from home. He was beginning to lose count of the number of doors he had knocked on, the number of people he had asked. At times, he went hungry, using whatever small change he had for bus fare or the occasional meal to keep his energy up. The city had started to feel like an endless maze, and the search for his father seemed like chasing a shadow. On a particularly cold evening, he found himself in the crowded lobby of an upscale restaurant, clutching the photograph tightly. He was tired, worn out from the countless rejections, and the faces of indifferent strangers around him only made him feel more alone. As he stood there, he noticed a man exiting a sleek car parked at the restaurant's entrance. The man's presence was commanding, and he exuded an air of confidence that reminded Bruce of the man in his photograph. With a pounding heart, Bruce pushed through the crowd and approached him, barely managing to steady his voice as he introduced himself and held up the photograph. The man looked at Bruce with a mixture of irritation and amusement, then waved him off, saying he had no time for street kids looking for handouts. Bruce felt a mix of shame and anger rise within him, but he bit his tongue, watching as the man strode away without a backward glance. But just when Bruce thought he'd reached the end of his rope, he spotted him, the man in the photograph, standing at the edge of a charity gala, chatting with a group of other well-dressed guests. Bruce's heart raced, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he had dreamed of during countless sleepless nights. He took a deep breath, clenched his fists, and summoned every ounce of courage he had. Ignoring the stares of the people around him, he made his way through the crowd and approached the man. The man, who was indeed Jimmy, glanced down at Bruce with a slight frown, clearly taken aback by the boy's sudden appearance. Bruce swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper as he said the words he'd been rehearsing in his mind for weeks. "My mum. She said that you're my dad," he declared, his voice filled with both hope and defiance. Jimmy's face froze, the cheerful expression replaced by a mix of shock and discomfort. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just looked down at Bruce, who was trembling slightly under his intense gaze. Around them, murmurs began to ripple through the crowd as people turned to watch the scene unfolding. Rose, Jimmy's wife, was among them, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief as she registered the boy's words. She took a step forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked between Bruce and Jimmy, as if searching for some hint of familiarity in the boy's face. The silence grew thick, tension filling the air as everyone waited to see what Jimmy would do. Bruce felt his heart pounding, each beat echoing in his ears, but he refused to look away. He had come too far, endured too much to back down now. Finally, Jimmy found his voice, though it was strained and unsteady. He told Bruce that he must be mistaken, that he didn't know what he was talking about. But Bruce stood his ground, his gaze unwavering as he held up the photograph, pointing to it with a trembling finger. "This is you," he insisted, his voice cracking, "and this is my mom. She showed me this picture. She told me about you." Jimmy glanced at the photograph, his face paling slightly as he took in the image. For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes, a recognition perhaps, or a pang of guilt. But then he quickly masked it, clearing his throat and looking away. Rose's face twisted with a mixture of betrayal and anger. She grabbed Jimmy's arm, her voice sharp as she demanded an explanation. "Who is this boy?" she asked, her tone filled with accusation. "Is what he's saying true?" Jimmy stammered, trying to assure her that this was just a misunderstanding, that he had no idea who Bruce was. But the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him, and Rose wasn't convinced. She took a step back, her expression hardened as she looked between Jimmy and Bruce, clearly struggling to process the situation. Bruce felt his hope beginning to crumble, but before he could say anything else, Jimmy spoke, his voice tinged with guilt and regret. He admitted that there had been someone, a long time ago, a woman he had once loved but had parted ways with under complicated circumstances. He didn't know if Bruce was his son, he claimed, but he couldn't deny the possibility. Rose's face fell, and she turned away, visibly shaken. Bruce felt a pang of sympathy for her, even as he grappled with his own emotions. As the night wore on, Jimmy took Bruce aside, away from the curious stares of the crowd. He told him that he would do what he could to help, but that this was a delicate situation and he needed time to sort things out. Bruce didn't fully understand, but he nodded, relieved that Jimmy was at least willing to consider the possibility. However, Rose remained distant, her distrust evident in the way she avoided looking at Bruce. In the days that followed, Jimmy arranged for Chloe, to be moved to a better hospital, ensuring she received the care she desperately needed. He even invited Bruce to stay with him temporarily, though it was clear Rose was less than thrilled about the arrangement. She kept her distance, watching Bruce with a wary eye, as if expecting him to bring chaos into her life. Bruce felt the tension but tried to keep to himself, hoping that with time she might come to accept him. For now, he focused on his mother, grateful for the chance to be with her again, even if it meant navigating the complex emotions swirling around him. As Bruce settled into Jimmy's home, he couldn't help but feel like an outsider. The house was massive, filled with gleaming furniture, luxurious decor, and rooms that seemed endless. Everything about it was foreign to him, from the marble floors that clicked under his shoes to the towering walls lined with portraits of people he didn't know. Jimmy tried to make him feel comfortable, but the tension in the house was palpable. Rose kept her distance, moving silently from room to room, her gaze cold and unreadable whenever she happened to glance his way. Bruce could sense that she didn't trust him and resented his presence, as if he were an intruder disrupting her carefully curated life. Despite the strained atmosphere, Bruce was grateful to be close to his mother. With Jimmy's support, Chloe had been transferred to a high-end hospital where she received top-notch care. The sterile white walls and constant beeping of machines were overwhelming at first, but Bruce focused on the one thing that mattered. Chloe was safe and being looked after. He visited her every day, sitting by her bedside and telling her about his experiences in Jimmy's house, though he often held back the details of how out of place he felt. Chloe, still weak, would squeeze his hand, her face softening as she whispered words of encouragement. She told him to be patient, that things would get better and that they were finally on the path to healing. Her words gave Bruce hope, even as he struggled with the uncertainty of his new life. Rose's distance, however, gnawed at him. Every time he saw her, he felt a pang of guilt, as if his very existence was a burden on her. She avoided him as much as possible, spending most of her time outside or in rooms where he wasn't allowed. Bruce tried to respect her boundaries, feeling that he owed her at least that much, but he couldn't shake the loneliness that followed him everywhere. At night, he would lie awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the silence and wondering if he truly belonged here. The warmth he had hoped to find in a family felt more like a distant dream, something that would never quite be his. But everything changed one evening, when Chloe's condition took a sudden turn for the worse. Bruce had been sitting beside her bed, holding her hand and talking softly when her breathing grew shallow, and her eyes fluttered, closed. Panic surged through him as he frantically pressed the call button, his voice trembling as he called for help. Nurses and doctors rushed into the room, pushing him gently out of the way as they worked to stabilize her. Bruce stood by the door, his heart pounding, watching helplessly as the medical team surrounded his mother's bed. It was a chaotic blur of voices, machines, and urgent commands, and for the first time, he felt utterly powerless. In his desperation, he ran to find Jimmy, who was in the middle of a meeting in one of the hospital's private conference rooms. Bruce burst in, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. Jimmy, sensing the urgency in his expression, excused himself immediately and followed Bruce back to Chloe's room. When they arrived, the scene was even more intense. Chloe's heart had stopped, and the doctors were performing CPR, trying to revive her. Bruce's legs felt weak as he watched, his mind barely able to process what was happening. He stood frozen, tears streaming down his face, feeling as if his entire world was slipping away. Jimmy, seeing the boy's anguish, placed a hand on Bruce's shoulder, a rare gesture of comfort. He whispered words of reassurance, though his own face was tense with worry. For the first time, Bruce felt a sense of connection with him, a silent bond born out of shared fear and desperation. The two of them stood side by side, watching as the doctors fought to bring Chloe back. It was a moment that stretched into eternity, every second heavy with the possibility of loss. Bruce clung to Jimmy's arm, feeling both vulnerable and strangely secure, as if in this shared grief he had finally found something resembling family. After what felt like an eternity, one of the doctors turned to them with a solemn expression, informing them that they were able to revive her, but her condition remained critical. Relief flooded Bruce, though it was tempered by the knowledge that his mother was still far from safe. He wanted to rush to her side, but the doctors advised him to wait until she was stable enough for visitors. Jimmy kept his hand on Bruce's shoulder, offering silent support as they processed the news together. For Bruce, this small gesture was a lifeline, a reminder that he wasn't alone, even in his darkest hour. In the days that followed, Jimmy became more involved in Bruce's life, sensing the boy's need for guidance and support. He took Bruce out for walks around the hospital garden, talking to him about his own life and past, filling in some of the gaps that Bruce had always wondered about. He spoke of his younger days, his ambitions, and his regrets, including the choices that had led him away from Chloe. Though he never explicitly admitted it, Bruce could tell that Jimmy felt a deep sense of guilt for not being there when they needed him most. These conversations, though often heavy, brought them closer together, allowing Bruce to see Jimmy as more than just a figure in a photograph. However, their growing bond only deepened Rose's resentment. She watched the two of them from afar, her expression hardened with suspicion and jealousy. She felt as if her world was crumbling around her, and Bruce could sense the turmoil beneath her icy demeanor. One evening, she confronted Jimmy, her voice laced with anger as she demanded to know what place Bruce and Chloe had in their lives. She accused him of betraying her trust, of allowing strangers into their home and disrupting everything they had built together. Jimmy tried to reassure her, but Rose was inconsolable, her hurt and confusion spilling over in a torrent of accusations. The argument left Bruce feeling more isolated than ever. He retreated to his room, trying to drown out the sound of their voices as they clashed over him and his mother. It was a painful reminder that despite Jimmy's support, he was still an outsider, a source of conflict rather than harmony. Yet, even in his sadness, he found himself feeling strangely hopeful. The moments he had shared with Jimmy had given him a glimpse of something he had never known before, a sense of family, of being cared for. He clung to that feeling, hoping that, in time, things might settle and Rose might come to accept him. A few days later, Chloe's condition improved, and she was finally able to receive visitors. Bruce rushed to her side, his heart swelling with relief as he saw her awake and smiling weakly. They held each other, words unnecessary, as they shared a quiet moment of reunion. Jimmy stood nearby, watching them with a look of quiet reflection. For the first time, he reached out to Chloe, gently placing his hand on hers as he offered a heartfelt apology for the years of absence and the pain his choices had caused. Chloe accepted his apology with grace, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and forgiveness. It was a moment of reconciliation, a tentative step toward healing the wounds of the past. Rose, who had initially resisted visiting Chloe, eventually found herself drawn to the hospital, watching from a distance as Bruce, Jimmy, and Chloe shared a rare moment of connection. Seeing the vulnerability in Bruce's face, the quiet strength in Chloe's, and the remorse in Jimmy's softened her heart, if only slightly. She began to realize that, despite her reservations, this boy and his mother were not threats to her family, but people in need, struggling just as she had in her own way. Tentatively, she approached Bruce, her expression gentler than he had ever seen it. She spoke to him softly, asking about his mother's health and listening as he told her about Chloe's long battle with illness and the challenges they had faced. As they talked, something shifted in Rose. She saw Bruce not as an intruder, but as a young boy who had known only hardship, who was simply trying to save the one person he loved most. Gradually, she opened up to him, her heart thawing as she saw the strength and resilience within him. It wasn't an immediate acceptance, but it was a start, a bridge forming where there had once been only walls. Bruce felt a sense of relief, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could belong here. Not as an outsider, but as part of a family. The pain and uncertainty still lingered, but in that moment, he knew he wasn't alone. Together, they all stood on the edge of a new beginning, one filled with the possibility of healing and acceptance. And for Bruce, who had spent so long searching for a place to belong, it was more than he had ever dared to hope for. In the days that followed Rose's conversation with Bruce, a new sense of warmth began to permeate the household. It was tentative and fragile, like the first rays of dawn after a long night. Rose's initial steps toward accepting Bruce and his mother brought a sense of peace that softened the tense atmosphere. Although she still struggled with the complex emotions surrounding her husband's past and the arrival of a son she had never expected, Rose found herself slowly opening up to the idea of including Bruce in her life. She began with small gestures. She would leave a warm breakfast for him in the morning, a quiet acknowledgement that he belonged there. Occasionally, she would ask him about his day or offer a small smile when their paths crossed. For Bruce, these moments meant more than he could express. After spending so long feeling like an intruder in their home, these small acts of kindness felt monumental. He found himself looking forward to the mornings, wondering if she would say something, if there would be another small gesture that made him feel welcome. As Rose opened her heart, she began to see Bruce through a new lens. His resilience, his quiet determination, and his loyalty to his mother were qualities that both inspired and humbled her. She saw the sacrifices he'd made, the hardships he had endured, and began to understand the depth of his love for Chloe. One evening, she sat down with Jimmy, speaking openly about her fears and insecurities, and how she had come to see Bruce as more than just the child of another woman, but as a brave, kind-hearted boy who had become part of their lives. Jimmy listened, his own heart moved by her willingness to see past her initial distrust. With Rose's acceptance, Bruce felt a growing sense of stability, a feeling that had once seemed unreachable. He was no longer just a visitor. He was part of something larger than himself. And for the first time, he experienced what it was like to be supported, to be cared for by people who wanted him there. This newfound sense of belonging filled him with a quiet joy, a feeling he hadn't dared to hope for. He saw Chloe's health improving, felt the warmth of Rose's kindness, and sensed Jimmy's steady presence as a source of guidance. It was everything he had ever dreamed of, but had never believed could be his reality. Chloe's recovery progressed steadily. Her strength returned bit by bit, and the color came back to her cheeks. Every day, Bruce would visit her, sharing stories about his experiences with Jimmy and Rose, telling her about the newfound harmony he had found in their home. Chloe listened with a gentle smile, her heart swelling with pride and relief at the peace Bruce was finally experiencing. She had spent so long worrying about his future, fearing that he would be left alone in the world. But now, seeing him embraced by a family, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a quiet satisfaction that her son would not be alone when she was gone. As Chloe grew stronger, she spent more time with Jimmy, who became a comforting presence in her life. They spoke of the past, of the roads they had each taken, and the choices that had led them here. They laughed over memories, shared moments of regret, and found forgiveness in each other's company. Jimmy admitted that he had always wondered about her, had often thought about what might have been. Chloe, with her characteristic grace, forgave him, understanding that life had taken them in different directions, but had finally brought them together again, if only for a short time. Their reconciliation was both healing and bittersweet, a recognition of the love they had shared and the lives they had built apart. As the days turned into weeks, Bruce's relationship with Rose continued to deepen. She began to see him as her own, feeling a fierce protectiveness toward him that surprised even her. She would fuss over his meals, remind him to rest, and even help him with his schoolwork, guiding him with patience and encouragement. Bruce, who had never known the feeling of being mothered in such a way, felt his heart open to her in return. Her gentle reprimands, her quiet guidance, and her unwavering support became a source of comfort he had never known. He found himself calling her Mom one evening, the word slipping out before he could catch it. She froze for a moment, her eyes filling with tears, and then she smiled, reaching out to embrace him. It was a moment of pure acceptance, a confirmation that he was now truly part of their family. As Chloe continued to recover, the family dynamic shifted once more, settling into a rhythm of warmth and unity. Bruce felt his own confidence grow as he thrived in the nurturing environment. The memories of his time on the streets began to fade, replaced by new ones filled with laughter, security, and the quiet joy of belonging. He felt the weight of his past lifting, replaced by a hopeful vision of the future. Jimmy became a steady presence in his life, a guiding figure who offered him advice, taught him practical skills, and showed him what it meant to be a man of integrity. Bruce soaked it all in, feeling the bond between them deepen with every shared experience. The family spent time together in ways that Bruce had never experienced before. They had meals as a family, took walks in the nearby park, and even started a weekly tradition of movie nights. Each evening, they would gather in the living room, blankets piled high and snacks in hand, laughing together over silly comedies or feeling the tension in action movies. For Bruce, these moments were everything. He would sit beside Rose, who would drape an arm around his shoulders, while Jimmy would share a knowing smile with him from across the room. Chloe, too, would be there, her laughter filling the room, her face radiant with joy as she saw her son surrounded by love. One crisp autumn afternoon, the family went to the hospital for what would be Chloe's final checkup before she was discharged. Bruce held her hand as they walked through the halls, his heart swelling with pride at how far they had come. Chloe looked around, taking in the surroundings with a soft smile, knowing this chapter of her life was closing. She felt a sense of peace, knowing her son was in good hands, loved and cherished by a family that had opened its doors to him. She glanced at Jimmy, her eyes filled with gratitude, and at Rose, who returned her look with a smile that spoke of friendship and shared understanding. As they left the hospital, they walked together down the street, their footsteps in sync, laughter and conversation filling the air. Bruce looked around, taking in the beauty of the moment, realizing that this was the life he had always dreamed of. He had a family, a home, and a future bright with possibility. For the first time, he felt no fear, no uncertainty, only a deep contentment and a sense of purpose. They were together, all of them, and he knew in his heart that they would face whatever came next as a united front. In the months that followed, the family settled into a new normal. Bruce grew stronger, more confident, his once-lost childhood returning to him in small, joyful moments. He excelled in school, supported by Rose and Jimmy, who encouraged his dreams and helped him believe in himself. Chloe regained her strength and found a new purpose, sharing her story with others, helping those who had also struggled, and becoming a beacon of hope for those in need. Her bond with Rose deepened, the two women finding friendship and support in each other's company. Bruce's life became a series of small, precious moments, sharing quiet conversations with Rose, laughing with Jimmy over silly jokes, feeling Chloe's loving gaze as she watched him grow into the young man she had always hoped he would become. They celebrated birthdays, shared holidays, and built traditions that became the fabric of their lives. Bruce no longer thought of himself as an outsider. He was a son, a brother, and, above all, a part of a family that loved him unconditionally. As time went on, Bruce came to understand that his journey, though filled with hardship, had brought him to a place of love and belonging. He had faced countless challenges, endured loneliness, and grappled with a world that seemed indifferent to his struggles. But in the end, he had found something rare and beautiful. A family bound not by blood alone, but by a choice to love and support one another through every trial. His journey was a testament to resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was hope, there was family, and there was a future waiting to be built. And so, as the years passed, the family remained united, their lives intertwined in ways they could never have foreseen. Bruce thrived, surrounded by love, support, and a deep sense of belonging. Chloe found peace, knowing her son was safe and cherished, while Rose and Jimmy discovered the joy of an expanded family. Together, they forged a new beginning, their lives forever changed by the journey they had taken, a journey from hardship to healing, from separation to unity, from fear to love. For Bruce, it was everything he had ever wished for, and more than he had ever dared to hope.